The rain doesn't fall the way it used to. Once it was clear, heavy, cleansing. The sort of thing that would slick your hair down to your forehead and leave puddles for children to splash in. Now it drifts from the sky in clumps as if the clouds have forgotten how to weep properly. It sifts down as grey flakes, a mixture of water and ash that clings to your skin like soot and burns the back of your throat when you breathe too deeply. They call it ashfall, but those of us still
alive don't call it anything at all.
We just brace ourselves when the skies go black and the air turns heavy, and we hope the storm passes before it buries us alive. The world ended quietly. Not in one day, not in one blast, but in a long, drawn-out collapse that people denied until it was far too late. At first, it was the summers. Hotter, longer, burning crops into brittle straw. Then came the storms, more frequent, ripping coastlines apart as if the earth itself had grown tired of our buildings. The final stage was fire. Forests ignited like match heads, cities burned, and all that smoke climbed into the sky, choking the sun until the seasons themselves forgot their order. That's what gave us this endless half-light, this dim and colourless existence where rain turns to ash before it hits the soil. If you wandered the streets of the old world, you wouldn't
Recognize them now.
Highways are fractured, ripped apart by heat and shifting ground. The skeletons of cars sit there, eaten away by rust and time, their windshields filmed with grime so thick you can't see through. Cities fare worse. Towers that once touched, the clouds now lean broken, glass scattered like knives across dead pavement. Signs still hang in the wind, but the words are meaningless. Malls, schools, stadiums, all hollowed out, taken over by mold, smoke, and silence. Sometimes, when the wind shifts, you can still smell what's left of them. The charred reek of wood, the chemical tang of melted plastic, the sour rot of things left too long without the dignity of burial. It lingers in your clothes, your hair, in the back of your mouth when you wake at night. That smell is everywhere, inescapable, as much a part of the air as oxygen once was. The government didn't collapse in a single breath. It withered piece by piece as supplies ran thin and disasters piled higher than aid could reach. At first, there were announcements, ration schedules, curfews, promises that help was on the way. Then the voices went silent. No one made it official. No one came on the radios to say, "We are finished." They just stopped. Some say fragments of government still exist in the bunkers buried deep underground, but if they do, they don't waste their resources on the surface anymore. Up here, we're on our own. What remains of civilization is fractured. There are survivor groups, bands of families or strangers bound together by shared hunger and fear. Some form settlements in old warehouses or churches, boarding up the windows,
digging shallow wells, trading what scraps they can. Others turn feral, raiders, scavengers, people who take rather than share, who've learned that steel and firepower last longer than trust.
If you see smoke on the horizon, you never know if it means warmth and community or the ruins of someone else's shelter torn apart. Institutions? There are none. Schools are nothing but chalkboards peeling in the damp. Hospitals, if you find one intact, are stripped of medicine, their wards lined with the graffiti of the desperate, names scrawled on walls, last messages to the missing. Even churches feel abandoned, their pews scattered and their altars broken, though sometimes candles still burn there, tiny flames trembling in the dark, proof that someone still remembers prayer, even if no one listens anymore. The land itself has grown alien. Rivers are shallow trickles choked with mud and ash. Lakes have receded to their bones, leaving boats stranded in fields of cracked mud. Forests are blackened, the trees standing like charcoaled fingers, scratching at the air. When the wind blows across them, you hear their hollow groan, like the earth itself is mourning. Wildlife is scarce. Most birds vanished with the smoke. The few animals that remain are gaunt shadows of what they were, ribs pushing through skin, eyes wary and hungry. Every day carries a tension in the air, not just from hunger or thirst, but from the uncertainty. You never know if the next rainfall will smother the land in ash, if a windstorm will strip the roofs from your shelter, or if someone desperate enough will pry open your door at night with a knife in their hand. No one sleeps soundly anymore. Even in the silence, even in the hours where the world seems still, there's a gnawing sense that the next disaster waits just beyond the horizon. Somewhere under the ash, you can still find fragments of the world that was. A child's shoe half buried
in the dust.
A cracked photograph pressed between broken bricks. A rusted bicycle leaning against a fence that no longer stands. These are the ghosts of what came before, and they are reminders, not just of what we lost, but of what the world refuses to give back. The sky hangs low, heavy and bruised, and it hasn't been blue for years. People say it never will be again. Still, sometimes, when the clouds shift and the horizon glows faintly red, I catch myself staring, waiting for something impossible. The return of color. The return of rain that cleans instead of poisons. The return of a world that felt alive instead of buried. But waiting is dangerous. Hope is dangerous. In this world, you learn quickly. If the rain doesn't kill you, the waiting will. If you're still tuned in, if you've managed to cobble together enough wire and rusted metal to pull my voice from the static, then you already know my name. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you've only caught pieces of me between storms, just fragments. A cough, a laugh that doesn't sound like one anymore, a warning about the ashfall. Either way, I'll say it again for the sake of the record. My name is Caleb Wright. Once upon a time, I was a school teacher. History, of all things. I used to stand in front of bright-eyed kids in pressed uniforms and talk about civilizations. Long gone, the Romans, the Mayans, the fall of empires, and the rise of others. I thought I was teaching them how to understand the past, maybe even the future. Turns out I was just giving lectures on how everything eventually collapses. Now I'm the last station still humming in this dead stretch of land. My transmitter is nothing special. Just scraps bolted together, soldered wires scavenged from gutted cars and stripped appliances. The generator is pedal-powered, a bicycle rigged to keep the current alive. My legs ache most nights, but the hum of that wheel is the closest thing I've got to company. If I stop pedaling, I stop speaking. And if I stop speaking, maybe the world forgets itself entirely. You might be wondering how I've survived. To be honest, I ask myself the same question every morning. The answer isn't elegant. It's not the kind of tale you'd carve into stone or pass down as legend. Survival here is ugly. It's scraping mildew off basement walls because it still counts as food. It's boiling water 3, 4, 5 times over and still gagging. At the grit that settles in the bottom of the pot. It's trading batteries for jerky for antibiotics, and antibiotics for a few hours of trust with strangers who might slit your throat while you sleep. I keep to the ruins of an old broadcasting station. The walls are cracked, the windows patched with sheet metal, but it's still standing, and it still has a roof that keeps most of the ash out. The antenna towers are bent, but one is just high enough to scrape a signal into the grey sky. I sleep in the old sound booth, foam panels torn and yellowed, the desk scarred with burns and scratches. I like to imagine some DJ once sat here, spinning records for people stuck in traffic, never knowing how precious that kind of normality really was. At night, when the generator is silent and the static eats the room whole, I feel the ghosts pressing in. Not real ones, not yet anyway, but memories. My wife, Mara, humming in the kitchen while rain tapped gently against the glass. My boy, Eli, his hair damp, tracking mud across the carpet after soccer practice. They were the kind of memories you used to take for granted, the ordinary kind that felt endless. They didn't make it through the fires. The ash swallowed them, like it swallowed everyone else. It would be easier, maybe, to stop talking about them, to let their faces fade like everything else. But if I stop saying their names, if I stop remembering out loud, then it's like they never existed. That's part of why I keep this station alive. For me, for them, and maybe for anyone else who's lost someone and needs proof that memory still counts for something. People sometimes ask. When I pick up survivors on shortwave, when the signal bounces clean enough to let a voice through.
Why I bother? Why keep broadcasting when no one answers most nights?
Why not just go silent and conserve the strength it takes to keep going? The truth is, I don't know. Habit, maybe. Or maybe it's because silence is worse than hunger, worse than thirst. Silence means nothing's left. As long as a human voice cuts through the static, even if it's mine alone, then this world hasn't gone completely to hell. Not yet. Hope is a fragile thing. I don't carry much of it around anymore. I don't believe the sky will clear tomorrow, or that the rivers will suddenly swell with fresh water again. I don't expect the government to ride back in with supplies and order. But I do carry something smaller. Maybe not hope, exactly, but responsibility. A stubborn refusal to be the last voice that fades. I tell myself, if I can keep one person moving, if I can convince someone to keep walking through the ash just one more day, then maybe the story doesn't end here. I've crossed paths with others, of course. Survivors drift through sometimes, carrying their own scars, their own losses. Some trade with me, a can of beans for a half hour on the mic, so they can broadcast a message to anyone out there listening. They send names into the void, names of lost sisters, fathers, sons. I let them. Even if no one answers, it feels holy in its own broken way. Like we're carving their memories into the static itself, leaving something behind that the ash can't erase. Others aren't so kind. I've fended off raiders more than once, desperate people with hollow eyes and rusted blades. They don't want my voice, they want the batteries, the food, the roof over my head. Each time I've managed to drive them off. Sometimes with words, sometimes with fire. Sometimes with nothing more than the madness in my eyes. But each encounter leaves another crack in me, another reminder that survival is more about luck than strength. What keeps me going? I ask myself that question more than I care to admit. Sometimes I think it's Mara and Eli, the way I can still hear their laughter in the quiet. Sometimes I think it's the listeners, the scattered few who tune in at night, who send me static-filled whispers of gratitude or warnings or rumors of safe havens, and sometimes I think it's just sheer stubbornness. I refuse to let the world end without someone marking its passing. Every time I sit behind this battered microphone, I remind myself this is what's left of civilization, not the governments that crumbled, not the cities that burned, not the
monuments buried under ash. It's us, the ones still breathing, still talking, still remembering. As long as we keep speaking, we're not gone.
Not entirely. I may not have much. No family, no community, no certainty of tomorrow. But I still have this signal. I still have this voice. And until the day my lungs give out or the ash seals me under, I'll keep sending it out there.
Into the grey. Maybe it'll reach no one. Maybe it'll reach you. And if it does, know this. You're not alone. Even when it feels that way. Someone is still speaking. Someone is still remembering. And maybe that's enough. If you've been listening this long, you know the weather doesn't obey rules anymore. It negotiates. It bargains. It bargains poorly.
The crisis that stalks us now is not one single headline. It's a weeping wound made of many smaller cuts. Drought braided with heat, fire braided with smoke, storms braided with ash. Together they make a landscape that remembers how to kill. It started, for most people, as a season that refused to end. Summers baked the soil until it cracked like old paint. Rivers that had run for 1,000 years grew thin and threadbare. Lakes withdrew from their banks the way people pull away from a promise. Then the forests started to go. Not all at once, but in fits. Lightning, human error, county after county reduced to charcoal. The smoke climbed into the stratosphere and stayed there, carrying with it something worse than darkness. Particles, soot, chemicals from burned plastics and fuels that changed how the clouds behaved. Rain that used to fall soft and sustaining now arrives wrapped in grit and a chemical tang, sometimes acidic enough to burn the skin of plants and the thin rubber we use to patch our shelters. You hear the official-sounding phrases on old recordings: atmospheric aerosol loading, feedback loops, altered jet streams, and they sound like excuses when you're standing ankle-deep in ash and trying to catch the last of the water from a leaking gutter. But there is a logic to the collapse if you listen for it. Heat makes evaporation more voracious. Evaporation sucks the life from rivers and soils. Dry land burns fiercer. Fires throw more particulates into the sky. Particulates dim the sun and make precipitation erratic. The more the land dries, the less vegetation there is to hold moisture. The less moisture, the less cloud formation where it used to be. A cycle starts and it keeps going until the season is a permanent condition.
Ash itself is not just inert dust.
It carries the ghost of what burned. Wood and leaves, yes, but also plastics, treated timber, fuel, the chemicals from factories. That means when the ash slakes into rain, it sometimes carries acidity, heavy metals, and volatile compounds. That's why wells taste metallic now, why you can't plant seeds and expect anything but stunted shoots, and why masks don't feel like an affectation here. They're a thin barrier between you and particles the size of a single grain. Rice that lodge in your lungs and refuse to leave. My station is on the edge of what used to be a transit corridor, a place people took for granted. The antenna scrapes a radio horizon full of dead voices, but sometimes, like a heartbeat, something answers. Lately, what answers has been a rumor, a green pocket 2 days' travel north, a place where the ash hasn't choked the soil, where water gathers and people have started to steal their future back, inch by careful inch. The rumor is a rope to some, a lie to others. Rumors are the currency of the desperate. This is where survival becomes a contest, and not just with the weather. With scarcity comes hunger, and hunger leaches civility out of people the way ash leaches color from leaves. There are the groups that try to rebuild gardens behind boarded churches, rain catchments made from salvaged tarps and rooftop gutters, a rotation of watchmen to ward off thieves. They barter, carefully, canned food for labor, a broken solar cell panel for a night's radio time, a handful of seeds for an old map. Then there are the others. Raiders, yes, but also survivalist factions who read the world as a contest of dominance rather than a problem to be solved. They hoard, they surveil, they take. I've met both types in the last months. A cluster of farmers turned refugees came through with a wagon whose wheels had long since been repaired more times than they'd been built. They traded me a tinned jar of preserved greens for airtime to tell anyone listening where they were heading in the unshakable human hope that someone out there might be looking for them.
A former hydrologist, I'll call her Anna because she asked me to, brought printed charts and an argument I could understand. The old reservoirs were gone, but groundwater pockets remained, where impermeable rock created pockets. And if
you dug deep enough and lined your wells against ash infiltration, you could coax water out of the earth for a while longer. She had tools I didn't: a hand pump, PVC pipe, knowledge of the strata beneath our feet. She also had wounds. A child missing, a brother lost to a firestorm, and the kind of eyes that had learned to calculate what must be sacrificed for the many to survive. Then there are those who come in the dark. One night, I heard the crunch of boots outside the transmitter room and the whispering of metal. They wanted the batteries, the generator, and the food I kept hidden behind the crates marked "Don't Open." I don't know what made me raise my voice instead of my gun. Maybe it was the years of lectures where I talked about civic duty out of habit. Maybe it was the absurdity of shouting into the same space where I also begged. I told them over the microphone that there were children listening, that mothers had tuned in from blocks away and were trusting the signal to tell them where not to wander. For reasons I can't regret, the sound of my voice in the static was enough to make them hesitate. They took what they could and left. They left a warning carved into a door: "Keep quiet or we fix your noise." I sleep with that carved sentence like a stone in my chest. Every day brings another resource limit to the surface. Fuel for the generator is a list item I cross off and fear. Solar panels are stolen more often than they're found whole. Batteries run down in weeks if you run the lights. The radio eats them faster. Food is barter. Seeds are more valuable than canned food to some, because canned food can be burned in a raid, but a seed can become a patch of life. Water is the cruelest calculus. We boil, we distill, we filter with cloth and hope. We scrape condensation from the tubing of our pedal generators at dawn. We hold out bowls at night to catch what passes for dew and argue over whose roof gets the tarp. The science of it, when I explain it on air, for those who want something straightforward, reads like a bad weather report turned ugly. The jet stream, that great river of air that used to shepherd weather from place to place, grew violent and fickle as polar temperatures shifted. Heat differential made the stream buckle and stall. When it stalled over a region, that region baked while others drowned. The Hadley cell shifts pushed drought zones into places that had never needed to irrigate before. Ocean temperatures rose, and warmer seas mean more energy available for storms, but not necessarily regular rain. Instead, you get violent, destructive pulses that terrorize coastlines, then vanish. Compound that with the black carbon from endless wildfires, and you get clouds that either refuse to form or form toxic, thick with ash. That's what gives us the erratic downpours that ruin a season's crops in an afternoon and then leave the fields to bleed in dust for weeks. I try to fold these words into my broadcasts because people need to know the mechanics of the danger. Knowledge is a kind of armor. If you know which way the winds are likely to push ash, you can bar your windows on the right side. If you understand that groundwater pockets exist in certain strata. You might survive the dry summer with a well. Anna taught me a few actionable things I allowed on air. How to make a basic solar still from a plastic sheeting, not for large-scale water production, but to make a cup of safe water when boiling wood is a risk. And how to set a crude rain catchment that minimizes particulate infiltration by funneling runoff through a series of cloth and sand filters before collection. These are small, ugly inventions, but in this world, small and ugly is elegiacally valuable. Yet every piece of advice comes with a caveat. Distillation loses minerals. It gives you hydration, but not salts, and electrolytes, and long-term reliance on stripped water leads to a different set of problems. Boiling in old pots can release toxins from charred residues. Digging shallow wells without proper casing invites contamination. Survival is not only about having knowledge, it's also about having the right tools and time to apply it, and those two are in shorter supply than patience. And time is a predator now. Storm seasons have shifted and lengthened. Fire seasons begin earlier and last longer. The ashfall pattern has changed, no longer a random misery, but a cyclical menace. When the wind comes from the west, you hear an incision in the air as the first grains hit the corrugated roof. You think you have hours, maybe a day, to seal everything. Sometimes the ash rides in on a warm wind and surprises you by dissolving the sheets that held your tarp in place. Survival is one long, exhausted adaptation to what the sky decides to do. So we trade, we fight, we form alliances that last a season or a lifetime, depending on luck and how much trust any of us can afford. Anna stayed a week at the station and taught me how to test a well for turbidity using nothing but a clear bottle and the angle of light. A week later, a group of men came asking for her help, and she left with them toward that rumored green pocket. I haven't heard from her since. Maybe she made it. Maybe she didn't. Rumors are cruel because they can be both oxygen and mirage. There's a larger conflict simmering in the region now, one that threatens to make the daily grind of survival into something worse. A convoy of well-armed scavengers, ex-military some say, or ex-security contractors who found that law is less profitable than theft, has started to move between settlements, taking what they please and setting terms. They demand tribute in fuel and food from communities, and refusal is met with violence. Settlements that used to coordinate to fend off blazes and share water now find themselves calculating whether to feed their neighbors or buy time. The calculus breeds fractures. Fractures breed opportunity for those who would rule by force. I talk about this on air because I want people to hear each other's voices when decisions are being made. If a settlement is under threat, I'll give them airtime to call for help. If a convoy is moving through, I'll warn the surrounding camps. Sometimes I get ignored. Sometimes I get threats. Once, in a transmission that cut through the night like a blade, a voice told me, "Stop talking unless you want your tower to fall." I replied by playing a song someone had requested, a tiny defiance, and kept speaking. You survive the climate the way you survive a slow siege, by conserving strength, by sharing intelligence, by refusing to give up your signal. But the siege is mutating into war. The ash falls the same, but the people who walk beneath it are changing. That is the line of danger we cross every day. Not only whether the rain will poison the well, but whether the next hand reaching for the bucket reaches with grievance or with a blade. If you're listening and you're on the move, consider this small, bitter counsel. Aim for places where water collects, not where it spills. Travel by night when the ash settles and the wind dies. Trust slowly. Carry filtration, not hope. And if you hear a voice on the air that sounds like mine,
answer once. Tell us where you are. Tell us what you need. Tell us who you lost.
because in the raw arithmetic of our days, ash, ration, watch, the only thing that keeps us from becoming ghosts is that someone remembers to speak aloud the problem we face. And that someone for now is me. I pedal, I speak, I listen. We are, all of us, still trying to buy time from the weather. The weather is not inclined to generosity. The crisis is bigger than any one of us, but the decisions we make to hide, to help, to hoard, to share, will decide whether any of
us live to see green again. If you're tuned in, settle a little closer to the speaker. The hum you hear behind my voice isn't just the old generator.
It's the sound of a world counting down in small measures, battery ticks, the rasp of the pedal chain, the distant groan of wind through a broken tower. Lately, that hum has felt thinner, like it's being pulled through a sieve. I can hear the days getting smaller. The ash season lengthened again. It came with a kind of arrogance, like the sky wanted to prove it could ruin everything twice over. The rain started in the east, a hard grey curtain that smelled of copper and old wiring, and pushed across the plain in waves. It's become unpredictable in the worst way, violent enough to erase a season's worth of planting in an hour, yet leaving the wells to trickle the rest of the week. The little cisterns we kept under the eaves filled one night and were bone dry 3 days later, because what comes down sticks to the gutters like paste and never makes it into the barrels. We rationed. We always ration. I set the rules at the station: 1 cup of boiled water in the morning, 1 at night, no more than 2 spoonfuls of jam per slice of hardtack. I marked the days on a strip of cardboard with a nail. The cardboard sagged under. The weight of numbers. There were more crosses in that tally than I like to admit. People came in waves at first, small groups with tired eyes trading stories for salt and sugar. Then the groups grew bolder. The first raid was small. 2 men in oil-stained coats, one with a rifle whose stock had been carved down to fit the hand of someone younger than his face. They asked for food at first, then for water. When my reply was blunt, we had bread for 3 days, water for 1. The older one spat on the ground and told me the world owed him. He left with an apology that wore like a threat. We tightened the locks. I thought that would be the worst of it. It wasn't. A week later, just as dusk bled into the ash haze, the convoy came. They travelled on 3 patch trucks, each rigged, with makeshift armour, sheet metal welded over doorframes, sandbags at the windows. They moved like predators, slow and careful, listening for weak sounds. I watched them through a slit in the metal and thought about the last time I saw Mara. How she ran to the kitchen to grab the kettle and laughed at something small, at nothing. And I wanted that laugh back like a holy relic. I wanted a laugh. So badly I almost left the station that night before the convoy arrived, but I stayed. I told myself the tower mattered more, that the voice mattered more. They took what they wanted. Not much. A crate of canned tomatoes, a few batteries, the last roll of insulation. But they left the message we're all learning to accept. They know how to find you, and they will return if you make it easy. The worst part wasn't the goods. It was the way they cut the phone line to the next settlement and left the tower's light dim. Communication is currency now. You lose the light and you lose the map of the region. After that, trust became a tax you couldn't pay. People stopped stepping into the square without scouts. Trade caravans became caravans of armed men. Some settlements closed themselves off entirely, bolting shutters and letting the ash pile up around their doorways like a white moat. Others invited anyone in and were punished for it. I can't say there's a right way, only a list of choices that are tragedies in miniature. It was in the middle of this tightening that the new thing began, a signal that wasn't random, a pattern at a frequency I'd never used before. It started as a faint click at dawn, like someone practicing Morse beneath the rubble. At first, I thought it was the old telegraph lines trying to remember themselves. Then the pattern tightened into rhythm. 3 beats, a pause. 2 long, a pause, a single long heartbeat, over and over, day after day. It was subtle enough to miss if you weren't listening, but you learn to listen in this work. Sound is how we keep track of each other now. I recorded it and ran it through the little spectrum analyzer. Anna left me before she vanished. The cadence matched an old distress code we used in radio days. Not a distress the way it was meant, in not tying manuals, but a map. Someone was signaling coordinates in a stubborn, archaic way because they either couldn't broadcast plainly or they wanted to be filtered, heard only by those who still remembered how to read the old codes. The station called it the beacon in my head. Other voices on the shortwave named it things I didn't like: lure, trap. People started to listen. That's the problem with rumors. Once you seed the idea of escape, it spawns 1,000 migratory souls. Some were young and desperate and came with hopeful eyes and shoes full of holes. Others were calculating. A man who had once been a union foreman but now wore a necklace of teeth because ceremony is a story and stories feed the savage. They came bearing maps or promises or claims they'd been told this place was not only green but functioning, that someone somewhere had made a pump that could lift water from underground without needing gasoline, that they had the blueprints, that they were only a day's walk north. I debated whether to broadcast the frequency. Telling everyone would be a kindness or a death sentence. Keeping it secret felt like hoarding. Anna had said once, in a voice that trembled as if from memory, "People will risk everything for a rumor that sounds like salvation." She left before we argued about whether to tell the world. Maybe she thought it would be a trap. Maybe she just couldn't stand the thought of staying. The tension inside me was simple and ugly. The station matters to everyone because it lets everyone know when to move, when to hide. But the station also anchors me. I am the voice for the people who can't move, the old, the injured, the ones who trade time at the mic for a chance to be heard. If I follow the beacon north, who speaks for them? If I stay, who will go to? Check whether the pump is true or whether it's another promise wrapped in rumor. I started sending probes, not people. That felt like consigning hope to risk it for me. I used pigeons once, foolishly. The birds, fattened for meat, refused to fly into the ash. I used the radio instead, subtle queries, testing the cadence, trying to coax more from the signal. At dawn on 3 mornings, a voice spoke faintly through the static. It sounded like an old woman's at first, then a man's, then a chorus of other voices under it, and each time it read a sequence of numbers and a place name that none of my maps had. The last one ended with the words, Green Well. That was enough to start a small migration. A small migration is all it takes in this world. People move like spores, pushed by wind and whisper. Word got out. Green Well. Water beneath the stone. Some begged me to broadcast the coordinates, others begged me not to. I said what I could without opening a gate. I warned, I counseled, caution. The thing is, warnings are polite ways to say, I don't know if you'll live if you go. Some took the warning and turned back. Others treated it like a dare. The first to go were 3 young men from a hamlet 2 valleys over. They left at night with 2 jerry cans and little else. The transmitter picked up static later that afternoon. A scuffle, a hit, the sudden silence. That only anger makes. 2 days later, a scrap of cloth was found on the old road, nailed to a post with a note, "Do not come." It is not what it says. The handwriting was shaky. The ink ran where rain had hit it. I read that note on air and felt my throat close as if someone had wrapped a hand around it. Then, as if to prove the world delights in cruelty, 3 more returned. Bleached, mud-scarred, carrying a young girl in their arms. She was not ours. Her hair was green with algae, her eyes wild with something between hope and shock. She spoke in a dialect I didn't understand and laughed sometimes at nothing. They said the water was real, but it was guarded. They wouldn't speak more. They only handed me a tiny vial of water and warned me not to drink much of it at first. It tasted of iron and something metallic. Later, when Anna's methodical instruction echoed in my head, I tested the vial with the little strip test she'd given me for acidity. It read, borderline, not safe for long-term consumption without mineral replacement, but real water nonetheless. This was the pivot. Some heard it and repacked their bags. Others argued that the risk of remaining was greater than the risk of leaving. I lost listeners to the trek north, and I gained new ones who came back to tell. Tales of a community organized around an old library and an underground cistern. I heard fragments, people planting with compost from human manure beds, a solar array made from scavenged glass, a network of tunnels dug under an old municipal reservoir. It sounded like invention and myth mashed together, an invention born of necessity is often the most dangerous sort. As small groups left, the raiders noticed. Scavenger convoys began to patrol the routes. Payments were demanded at makeshift tolls. A settlement 2 days east had its waterline cut and its children taken. For ransom, what shifts turned into ambushes. People started asking the worst questions. Is survival a right? Or is it a currency you have to buy with blood? My nights stretched longer. I listened to the empty spaces between transmissions and tried to fill them with meaning. I had nightmares where the beacon was a siren, and I followed it only to find everyone gone. I had other dreams where Mara returned with Eli, and the 3 of us took the pedal together, and the generator hummed, and the tower shone like a lighthouse you could sail a life by. Each morning I woke and pedaled until my feet bled, and the metal tasted of old coffee. The station needed me. The station needed the light I could put on the air. The people who left needed hope. The people who stayed needed me to not leave them in silence. Trust became an internal experiment. There was a man named Jax who arrived 1 week with a rig of tools on a broken cart. A welder, a coil of copper wire, a small crank that he said could jury-rig our antenna to pick up the beacon more clearly. He had scars across his hands and a laugh that dried in his throat. I let him in cautiously. He welded through ash and reminded me how useful hands can be when the world wants to fall through. He also hoarded matches in his boot and traded them like currency. When one night a patrol came and asked for him by name, I had to decide whether to hand him over to keep the station safe. I couldn't. I lied. Later, Jax left with the cart and never returned. He took our last roll of wire with him. I called him a thief and a coward in the same breath. That's what trust does to you. It teaches you to say both things at once. By the time the last frostless week of the season crept toward us, the station stores were thin, batteries at 60%, cans down to 19, water barrels at 2. People I had known for years left in single-file departures, their boots kicking ash that had been there when I'd first found the place. Each departure felt like a vote of no confidence in my ability to keep the light on. Each return, rare as it was, felt like a reprieve. And underneath it all, the beacon kept pulsing. 3 short, 2 long, 1 long, over and over. Sometimes the cadence changed, then resumed as if someone were clearing their throat. I knew more than I said on air. I knew less than I hoped. The tension didn't break so much as simmer, like a pot left on too low a flame for too long. It made everyone more dangerous, more determined, more fragile. I sit here now, at the edge of making a decision that will define the next arc of what remains of my life. Stay and keep the voice that guides the lost, or go north and see if the myth of the green well is a place or a promise. The people who remain will survive differently either way. The station will be quiet if I go. The beacon will keep pulsing whether I choose to answer it in person or with careful radio negotiation. But there is another truth I can no longer ignore. Things escalate. Ash falls. People move. Raiders learn routes. If the beacon is real, it may offer more than salvation. It may offer a blueprint for rebuilding. If it is a trap, it will take us in waves. If you hear silence from me tomorrow, remember that silence has meanings. If I come back changed, know that survival is a record of choices made under duress. If I never come back, remember, the world asked us to barter everything for a future none of us could guarantee. We bartered anyway, and that is worth telling, so I will keep peddling tonight, because that is what a radio does when it cannot decide which path to take. It keeps talking until the world answers. Keep listening. If you have news of the beacon, send it on frequency. If you're out there with a shovel and a will, keep the channel open. We are still learning how to trade rumor for proof. We will learn, or we will not. The ash has a vote, so do we. We left at dawn while the ash still slept on the roofs. The station's light winked out behind us like an old friend blinking in the dark. Not because I'd turned it off, but because the antenna had finally given up the ghost. I pedaled the generator until my legs cramped and the chain rattled, loose. I debated for a heartbeat whether staying and nursing that last fragile glow was cowardice or fidelity. In the end, I packed nothing but a rucksack, the little vial of green well water, Anna's charts, and a notebook where Mara once scratched, grocery lists that had become prayer. I told the people who stayed I'd be back, and their faces were maps of hope and worry. That is what people sound like without certainties. They fold both into their expressions and carry them like baggage. The beacon led us north through a landscape of autobiographies, burned-out schools with scorched lockers, playground swings. That sighed in the wind, grocery aisles where cereal boxes bleached in the ash. We moved in a ragged line. Leah, who'd come with me for reasons she told me slowly, and then not at all. Thomas, a tacit man with a knack for wiring, 2 farmers with wagons and gun barrels, a quiet boy named Omar who clicked his tongue at everything nervous. We had no militia, no uniform, only grit, a handful of tools, and the stubborn idea that we might be about to find something true. When we caught the ridge and looked down, I almost laughed and then almost cried, and then had both at once. Nestled in a bowl of scarred earth was a ghost of a town that had decided to keep itself alive. The library, an old municipal building, had been hollowed out into terraced beds and green roofs, its stacks repurposed into compost bins. Solar panels, many of them cracked, had been reassembled into a patchwork array. Most importantly, there was a shaft mouth ringed with stone and a hand pump rigged to it, and when the pump coughed and spat, water came out that wasn't brown, with ash, but glinted honest and dark like someone had remembered the color of river water. People stood around with buckets and faces that had forgotten to be polite. The beacon's cadence came from a weathered man named Harun, who still wore his university ID around his neck. He'd learned Morse in the old days and had set up the code because it weeded out the casual and kept the determined. Harun explained things to us with the careful patience of someone who still believed in syllables and sentence structure. The well sat where a band of impermeable rock had forced an underground stream into a pocket. They'd dug down and lined it with stone, and they'd set up a pump that could be powered by human crank, by a small thermoelectric array, or, when push came to shove, by an engine. They'd started with compost, learned to make biochar from scrub they burned in iron drums, used the char to filter runoff, and had built a system that turned swill into soil and soil into food. It was a small miracle sewn together with scrap and stubbornness. For a moment, as I watched Leah kneel down and touch the water, I allowed myself to feel selfish relief. Maybe the beacon was true. Maybe hope wore boots and came walking through ash. Then we heard the trucks. They rumbled up like an answering drum, 3 of them at first, and then more. And in their wake came a smell I knew too well. Diesel and the perfume of people who thought violence was a tool and not the last resort of the failed. The convoy's banners were homemade, their leaders wearing masks fashioned from old riot gear. They weren't interested in words. They wanted the pump and the people who tended it. They wanted control of the green patch because control meant
leverage, and leverage meant you could buy food and fuel and loyalty. They arrived with the self-satisfied swagger of men who had decided the world now owed them. Harun had seen them twice before and expected it.
He'd organized watches and repurposed library stacks into barricades. He'd taught every able hand how to work the pump and how to poison a trap with broken glass if need be. But his defenses were built for raids, not sieges. For a world of opportunists, not for a coordinated force that wanted to embed itself and extract tribute. I felt myself shrink into a teacher watching a class go frantic and knowing that the assignment had become real. We had a few choices and none of them were clean. We could try to hold the line and risk being overrun. We could abandon the place and take the knowledge away with us. We could offer a surrender and hope the convoy kept their promises. Each option seemed to trade a certain present for a likely worse future. The leader of the convoy stepped forward like a captain reading a list he'd already decided on. He said they would take 20% of the pump's output as tax and they would station men at the shaft. They would allow the settlement to keep the rest. Harun said no. His voice did something like a bell. The leader's hand left his side and returned with a pistol that had been modified to belch flame. The first shot burned a patch in the dirt and set an old tarp on fire. That's when the storm hit. We'd seen strange weather before, but nothing like this. A wall of ash roared down the valley, black and metallic, and it came with a wind so raw it peeled the skin from a man's knuckles if he wasn't careful. The convoy, thinking themselves gods, paid no attention. The first gust took their banners and wrapped them around grills. The second gust blew sand into faces and throats and made every man in that convoy stagger. To be outside in that wind, without protection, is to stand in a furnace of grit and acid. You cough until your ribs ache. You taste metal. You think you might vomit up your spine. Harun's people moved like a single organism. They slammed shutters quickly, but not blindly. They drove water barrels to the pumps and started rigging filters. Sand, charcoal, cloth, layered like an onion. While those of us with weapons took positions behind bookstacks and cracked walls. I remember standing by the pump with a length of pipe in my hands and thinking of Mara's hand on my sleeve and how many times she'd told me to keep my coat buttoned. The irony felt cruel. The convoy, caught in the bite of the storm, became reckless. They tried to rush the shaft, but the wind threw them off balance and one of their trucks fishtailed into a pile of old gas drums. There was a flash, a small fire that flared and then was suffocated by the wet grit. The leader bellowed orders that dissolved into coughing. People died that day on both sides, some from bullets, some from shrapnel, some because their lungs filled. Omar, the quiet boy, took a hit in the thigh and sank down with a sound like a broken hinge. Amid the chaos, the real choice loomed at me like a bruise. The convoy had men stationed along the ridge, and if they broke the pump or contaminated the shaft deliberately, this small pooled miracle would be gone for a generation. On the other hand, if we opened the old reservoir valves outside the basin, a desperate measure Harun presented to me in a hushed voice, we could flood the low ground, dilute ash concentrations, and create a safe perimeter long enough for folks to move equipment and seed. Flooding would cost nearby farms and structures, it would ruin some beds, and could mobilize contaminants downstream. It might also, in effect, turn the convoy's staging ground into swamp, bogging their trucks
and forcing them to retreat.
But the math was cruelty. You choose who to protect now and who to sacrifice later. I heard Mara in that moment. I heard the cadence of her laugh and the stubbornness of her hands in the kitchen, stirring a pot that never boiled over. I thought of Eli's small, grubby hands catching rain in a plastic cup. I had a sudden, animal clarity. I owed more than loyalty to my microphone. I owed the living the most brutal thing I could offer, a decision. We opened the valves. It was less cinematic than you'd imagine, and dirtier. Men in my makeshift crew ran to the old sluices, oil stiff and protesting like old knees. We levered, pried, and cursed, while others hauled sandbags and set up channels to steer the water away from living beds and toward the high ground where the convoy had parked. The first rush smelled of rot and ash and old chemicals. I gagged. Then, as the water choked into the gullies, it picked up silt and scrub and turned into mud that swallowed tire treads and slowed the convoy's engines. Men slipped, boots tore, and the trucks ground to an ugly mechanical halt. The flood didn't win the day alone. Harun's people fought with their fists and traps, and Leah, who had been quiet until then, surprised me with how she moved in the fray. A kind of precise ferocity that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with survival instincts, fused to desperation. The convoy faltered its momentum, and in the confusion, some of their own turned and fled. The leader, seeing the game slip, tried to burn the pump, but Thomas had already wired a crude countermeasure, a chain and a
steel plate.
The leader's torch flared and then guttered as rain, ash-laden and deliberate, fell from the sky like punishment, dissolving the flame. We held the town, we held the pump, we lost people. Omar's wound was worse than we thought. He survived, but he lost a piece of himself in a way that will be with him whenever he moves. Thomas limped, but laughed once, a brittle sound, when he saw the convoy truck stuck in the mud. Someone burned a banner, someone else sang something old and stupid and human. I sat by the pump after it was over, my hands smelling of petrol and river silt, and I felt like I had been hollowed and also filled. The station tower was gone when I thought about it, but down in the valley men and women were cradling buckets and rinsing the grit from their children's hair. The water was not paradise, it was work. It demanded tending, filtration, and guard shifts. It demanded a people who would sacrifice sleep and corn for the idea of tomorrow. That night, I broadcast. My voice was thin and cracked the way the line had been for months, but I spoke for as long as my lungs allowed. Coordinates, warnings, a how-to on setting up a charcoal and sand filter for wells, and, because I am who I am, a reading from Mara's grocery list that had become a litany. Sugar, lentils, matches, patience. I told people how we had bled and bargained and opened the valves. I told them the cost. I told them that the beacon was not a siren, but a lantern. Small, hard-won, and in need of hands. When the transmission ended, Leah pressed her palm against my shoulder and said something I hadn't thought to hope for. "We'll keep this channel open." She didn't mean just the radio. She meant the promise that if one place learned how to coax life from ash, they'd teach another. They'd pass along the pump design, the biochar trick, the small cruelty math of who to save. First, they'd carry the idea like seed. There was a cost. The station, the tower I'd tended like a gravestone and a chapel, would not stand forever without me. The pedal generator I had loved until my knees ached had been left behind, a shrine to decisions made. I thought of silence and how it would press. I thought of the idea that silence is not the absence of sound, but the absence of memory. I had nearly been convinced that keeping the light was the same as keeping the living. That night, muddy, bruised, and tasting metal, I understood that sometimes the living need the light to move, not to sit by it. The storm decreased in intensity the next morning, as if exhausted by its own fury. The convoy, mired and scattered, drifted off in pieces. Harun set up a schedule to share the pump's output. They created a rotor to teach others the filtration techniques. They wired the beacon into a network, not just a lure, but a map. They had no guarantee, none of us did. What we had was the shape of an answer, a mechanism, a community, and a stubborn choice to keep teaching what worked. I lay awake that night in the library turned infirmary and thought of the station's empty chair. I'd believed for a long time that being the last voice was a kind of sacred duty. I still believed in the voice, but I also believed in action. The two aren't always the same thing. You can speak into the dark and keep people anchored. You can also walk into the dark and bring back a bucket of real water. When I spoke on the air again, days later, my voice had grit in it and a quietness. That came from working hands. I gave coordinates where I could, warnings where I must, and lessons where I had them. The beacon's frequency became a thread, sometimes pulsing, sometimes steady, and more people answered. Sometimes they were fools, sometimes they were saints, sometimes they were both. I do not know if the decision to open the valves saved more than it cost. I do not know if Omar will forgive the day he bled on my knees, or if Leah will ever stop flinching when thunder passes. I do know that water ran where desert once scoured, and that in the middle of curated ruin, hands learned to mend and to teach. I know that the station's bulbs had gone dark behind me, and that the air tastes different when you drink something that didn't come from scavenged cans. Perhaps the true turning point wasn't the pump or the flood or the fight. Perhaps it was that someone in a ruined library decided the future was worth risking a second sacrifice for. Perhaps it was that I, who had been so afraid of silence, finally trusted that voices could multiply without me keeping each one alive. Maybe that is the most dangerous hope of all. That people will build scaffolding out of small mercies and keep climbing. The ash still comes, the weather still negotiates. The world hasn't made up its mind about mercy, but there's water now that tastes like possibility, and there are people who know how to make soil from rot. That night, when I lay my head down on a pallet and breathed the smell of wet wood and soot, I heard someone laugh, a small, honest sound. And it sounded a lot like a bell. When the mud dried enough to leave tracks that didn't suck out your boots, the valley breathed a little differently. Not healed, not by a long measure, but reorganized. Where the convoy's tracks had gouged the earth, green shoots pushed through the ruts, tentative and insolent. Haroun put it bluntly. Nature is not cured, it's learning to cheat the
Ash. That sounded right to me. What we'd done hadn't fixed the world. It had only shifted the contest. The pump kept us alive. Keeping it working took more than a hand and a crank. It took a plan.
They instituted a rota, 3-hour shifts on the pump, 3 people per shift, plus 2 on filtration duty. Charcoal beds had to be refreshed weekly, sand filters needed scouring twice a month. Children were taught to cup water and watch for grit. The elders learned to test by taste and by the strips Anna once gave me. We set up a trade schedule with 3 other settlements. They sent seeds and chicken feed, we sent knowledge and filtered water during dry spells. The beacon, the Morse latch I'd once debated broadcasting, became a mapped frequency. A simple network where each node learned a neighbor's pattern and relayed messages like a human internet. We traded coordinates, not promises. We traded methods, not myths. That exchange created slow change. The library roofs held gardens. Someone invented a compost kettle that didn't leak ash into the soil. Leah taught sewing circles for tarps. Women patched solar sheets and laughed while they worked, because laughter costs less than matches. Thomas patched radios and improvised batteries. Omar learned to limp without bitterness and to smile without trying to hide it. He still flinched when thunder rolled, but his wound closed and his gait steadied. He made a habit of carrying a small stone in his pocket, smoothing it, with his thumb when the ash felt too loud. Me? I kept speaking, but not like before. I spoke less as a cathedral bell and more like a relay. I'd moved my pedal generator into Haroun's workshop and jury-rigged a connector so I could broadcast at dawn and dusk, the windows of the network, when the winds were quieter. Nights, when the ash slept and the radio band carried the most information, belonged to the beacon. People learned to read the clicks to recognize the pause that meant safety ahead, the double long that meant
Avoid.
I taught others how to use a shortwave set. I taught Haroun's apprentice, a woman with a scar on her chin, how to weld antennae. The idea that I had once been the last voice had become ridiculous and precious. We had a chorus now, ragged, impatient, human. That chorus did not erase guilt. I hear my voice in the margins, the pedal wheel left behind at the station, the crate of canned tomatoes taken in the first raid, the man I lied to about Jax. I think especially of Jax, who left with our last roll of wire. Every time a new antenna
Rises, I feel the echo of his theft and the truth of my cowardice in hiding him. I think of the cardboard tally I left nailed to the station door, still counting days while it stands empty in the wind.
I had run away from a light I had sworn to protect because someone else needed to learn how to make lanterns. That is not absolution. It is the arithmetic of survival. Losses distributed until some line holds. People kept coming and going. Some returned to their settlements with instructions to dig a lined well or how to make a sand and charcoal filter. Others never came back. We found a torn photograph on the trail one morning, a boy's face half buried by ash, and we buried it where the ground would not swallow it whole. We made rites small and frequent, a burnt match stuck upright to mark a lost neighbor's bed, a bowl of boiled rice left at the pump for those keeping watch. Rituals became our scaffolding. They did not bring back the dead, they kept us from being swept clean by grief. The environment shifted unpredictably. There were days when a wind would lift the ash sufficiently that you could see a blue band at the horizon and you'd taste something like hope. Thin, easy to lose. Other days brought the metallic rain and the chemical stench. We learned to read the sky by ash density and wind pitch. We learned which shelters leaked and which held. Harun taught us how to test for heavy metals in water with a dye and a minute. Of light, a trick stolen from a book he'd kept folded beneath his coat. The birds returned in flurries, not in flocks. Sparrows first, then a brave heron that treated the new shallows like a buffet. The heron's long-necked diligence made the children start a game where they tried to walk as carefully as he did. If small lives come back first, maybe that is how healing begins. With habits. Not all healing was literal. The human landscape reconfigured in more complex ways. Trust morphed from commodity to protocol. Where once a stranger's appearance in the dusk meant a possible raid, now there were ways to approach. Leave a strip of cloth on the east fence, whistle a sequence, wait. A handshake became less important than a small repeated task. Showing you could carry water without spilling it, proving you would stand a rotation on guard. We established a ledger, not of names but of contributions. Time worked, seeds left, tools lent. It did not eliminate suspicion, but suspicion wears thinner when matched against repeated proof. There were consequences we could not ignore. The valve opening had saved a town but ruined some land downstream. A farmer whose terrace flooded a week later cursed our names with words I have not taught myself to repeat aloud. We paid restitution where we could, sending seeds and apprenticeship in composting, but restitution is a language with limits when people have lost roots and memories. We learned that every action scales outward. A valve is rarely a private thing. In a connected landscape, we learned to measure costs as well as benefits. Inside me, the change was quieter and slower. Where once I measured days by the spin of a pedal and the strength of a battery, now I measured by the number of new antennae I could help a neighbor raise. Where once silence felt like erasure, it now felt like a place to store what we'd learned. Silence could be used, repurposed for rest and planning rather than fear. My guilt did not vanish. It settled into the back of my mouth like the taste of ash on a good day. Yet there was also an honest relief when the beacon chimed and someone else answered it, and their voice, raw, patient, new, filled the gap I used to hold alone. Sometimes I walk back to the old station. The building has a new name now in my head, the Empty Bell. The chair in the booth where I used to sit is weathered and holds the shape of a different life. I stand there and run my fingers along the console and think of Mara's grocery lists and Eli's muddy hands. I do not sit. I have learned that duty is not always attached to a chair. I sing quietly to myself the songs I used to play on air for callers. They have become lullabies for people learning to sleep again with less fear. We have new enemies and old ones. The convoy was broken, scattered into bands that now trade in extortion rather than expropriation. They still lurk on major routes, and caravans hire watchmen. There are politics now, a crude council convened under Harun's library eaves, where men and women argue over who gets extra water in a dry month. I sit on that council as an advisor of sorts. My advice is practical and cluttered with the rhetoric of a teacher who still believes in syllables. I remind them that systems outlast strongmen if you build them to be useful. Teach a child to test water and she will not be fooled by a promise of purity. Teach a carpenter to build a filter and one fewer community will fall for a trick. At night, I dream different things than I did before. My nightmares still visit. Caravans on fire, Mara's face in the glare of something that was not meant to be, but the nightmares are less absolute. There are also other dreams now, a row of green roofs marching down a street, children cutting open a water bottle and planting seeds in the foam. I wake with a raw gratitude that feels almost obscene in its intensity. I spend mornings making lists again, not of rationed days, but of tasks. Mend the solar array, teach the youth to solder, check filters at dawn. I am older than I was when I pedaled that generator in a single room, and smaller in ways that matter. The station taught me self-reliance. The valley taught me interdependence. That difference has a shape. It's a hand extended for a tool rather than for a blanket. It's a voice that asks, what can you do? Instead of, what will you take? It's the realization that keeping the light on is sometimes less useful than knowing how to make lamps. We have found a kind of rhythm. The ash still falls. The rain still comes metallic. There are days that wake like wounds and nights that hold their breath. But in pockets, small, stubborn, human, life goes on with an intent that surprises me. Children grow into roles of watching and carrying. Elders teach purification by measuring and by story. A map is forming on radio bands that lists not just coordinates, but techniques and cautions and little songs to hum when you are scared. If anything in me has hardened into a creed, it is this. Survival is the slow work of building habits that outlast your anger. The pump will not cure the world. It will, however, keep hungry mouths from becoming desperate hands at the worst moments. It will buy time for seed to root. It will give someone the chance to teach another person how to make soil from rot. When I think of Mara and Eli, I no longer pace myself into endless litany. I speak of them often because speaking protects them from being a footnote. I show their names to the kids who come to learn radio. Mara Wright, Eli Wright. They nod with solemnity, as if the act of saying is an offering. Saying is small holiness in a world full of small cruelties. The valley is not a promise. It is a ledger of choices and an atlas of wounds and small mercies. We tally both. We keep the beacon's code simple and our ethics simpler. When you have water, you teach 3 people how to find it. When you find a tool, you teach 3 people how to use it. The arithmetic is clumsy, but it works more often than it fails. And me? I pedal less than I did, laugh more than I thought I would, and still sometimes wake in the dark with my palms pressed to my ears, listening for a silence that used to mean the end. Now the silence sometimes means rest. Sometimes it means someone is sleeping, teeth bared and tired, and will wake to go to the pump in the morning. We've bought time from the weather. Time is not a cure. It is the chance to keep trying. I do not know if the world will ever be what it was, and I don't spend my breath wishing for that. I spend my breath teaching someone to weld an antenna or to read the rhythm of the beacon. I have learned that to keep speaking is a duty, and to teach another to speak is the closest thing to hope I have left. If you've been listening through the static this long, you already know the rules. The sky will conspire against you sometimes. People will surprise you in both ways that hurt. and ways that heal, and every choice leaves a ledger. I used to think my ledger would be a single line: keep the light on or let the light go out. The last year taught me that ledgers are messy. They add up in odd columns, small kindnesses, stupid lies, brave risks, necessary cruelties. You learn to live with the arithmetic. We kept the pump. That sentence is small and blunt and contains a whole world. Keeping the pump meant schedules, filters, and 1,000 small disagreements solved with more patience than I thought we had. It meant Omar's limp and Leah's quiet ferocity and Haroon's patient syllables. It meant I stopped being the only voice and became part of a chorus that clanked and harmonized in the worst key you can imagine, and yet, somehow, in time it sounded like community. Do I call that hope? I call it something more honest, a choice to keep making the next day useful. Hope in this landscape is not a promise of sun and rain in the old way. It's a practice. It is showing someone how to test water with a scrap of cloth and a bottle. It is teaching a child to mend a solar mesh so she can charge a lamp. It is agreeing to stand a cold 3-hour watch so another person can sleep, without the fear that a convoy will come at dawn and take everything. These are small, trained gestures. They are survival's long, patient muscles. The ash still comes. The seasons still shift their moods like a beast with a temper. We still get rain that tastes like metal sometimes and wines that cough grit into lungs. The world did not revert. It is, in many places, worse. But it is not uniformly dead. There are pockets, small and stubborn, messy and temporary, where people have decided to practice preservation instead of pillage. Those pockets matter more than any speech I could make about large-scale redemption. What changed inside me isn't dramatic. I traded a sense of sacred duty to be the last voice for a livelier obligation, to raise voices, not hold them all myself. I found that if you teach a neighbor to broadcast, you get more radio time than you would have alone. If you teach 3 people to filter water, you don't carry the weight of 5 lives by yourself. If you leave the pedal at a silent tower and walk toward a pump, you accept that silence can mean work and not abandonment. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. Leadership is not always staying put. Sometimes it is deciding who to trust with the light so you can fetch a bucket. I still carry Mara and Eli with me. Their names are an easy barometer of what I've lost and why I keep moving. I speak them to children who come to learn the beacon's code and to the elders who teach compost. Saying their names is not griefs. Theatrics. It is an act of record-keeping. If memory is a form of life, then speaking is how we refuse to bury people twice. There are costs. The valley we flooded to stop the convoy's advance will never be the same in some places. Farms downstream.
Paid for our victory with soil and seasons. I sleep with that calculus in my veins. I will not pretend we always made the right choice.
What I will say is this. When the choice is to let a pump be burned or to turn a sluice and risk some fields, you pick the thing that keeps the most small mouths from becoming violent. The moral math is never clean. We learn to do less harm, not perfect good. If you want practical things from me, because I'm still a teacher at heart, take these. Learn to test water with light and taste. Improvise a sand and charcoal filter before you need it. Barter knowledge as fiercely as you barter food. Teach a young person to solder and a woman to weld a bracket. Invest time in protocols more than promises. A whistle code, a cloth on the east fence. A simple ledger of contributions. Keep your radio batteries feathered. Run short, precise transmissions at dawn and dusk when the winds are calmer. If you can, teach someone Morse. The beacon saved us because it filtered the curious from the committed. And to those of you who think leaving everything to find a miracle is the answer. Miracles are often built, not found. The green well we found was real, but it was real because people dug, lined, filtered, taught, and guarded. If a place looks green and inviting, ask how it became green. Ask who pays for its green. Offer to teach in exchange for a bed. If you take without teaching, you become part of the problem you ran from. I do not promise you a world made whole. I cannot. The weather will keep negotiating with us on brutal terms, and there will be more convoys and more choices that will bruise us. But here is what I can promise. Every small thing you teach another is horsepower for the future. Every song you pass on, every name you say aloud, is an antidote to erasure. If you keep the rituals, the burnt match for the dead, the bowl at the pump for the watchman, you keep the social fabric from unweaving entirely.
I do not promise you a world made whole. I cannot. The weather will keep negotiating with us on brutal terms, and there will be more convoys and more choices that will bruise us. But here is what I can promise. Every small thing you teach another
is horsepower for the future. Every song you pass on, every name you say aloud, is an antidote to erasure. If you keep the rituals, the burnt match for the dead, the bowl at the pump for the watchman, you keep the social fabric from unweaving
entirely.
Tonight, I will pedal in a different town than the one I began from. Tonight, the station's chair is empty, and that would have been a sacrilege once. Now it's a cathedral with more altars. I will broadcast at dawn the coordinates of a training session on filtration and radio procedure. I will read a list of names, some new, some old, because the smallest civic act we have left is to name the living and keep track of the missing. I will tell them to guard the pump, to teach 3 people to whistle if convoy lights approach. I will insist they keep a ledger and a rota, and that they bury their dead with a mark, so their descendants will someday know someone stood at that pump and fought the night. If you are out there listening, and you have nothing left but one small tool, give it away. If you have knowledge, share it, and ask for nothing but practice in return. If you have food, trade a lesson with it. We are trading survival by passing on craft, not by hiding caches. So this is what I leave on the air tonight. The world is still a classroom with some of its courses cancelled forever. The syllabus includes loss. It also includes making charcoal and testing water and building antennas out of scrap. The last is perhaps the smallest and most sacred. Teach someone to speak up, and you multiply the choir. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I do know that for today, there is water in a valley, people standing watch, and a network that remembers how to call a beacon. There is a child who can solder, and an old man who can still weld a plate. There is a place where someone will stand by the pump at dawn and sing a silly song to keep the heart steady. That, to me, counts for a kind of miracle. Keep the channel open, teach the neighbor, say the names, carry a stone in your pocket. Someone taught Omar that. And rub it when the ash feels too loud. Breathe. Do the next small, useful thing. This is Caleb Wright for anyone who remembers the sound of a radio and the taste of rain that wasn't ash. Keep listening, keep teaching, keep the tiny lights you can make. We are not finished yet.